We're going to continue on exploring some key fundamental economic issues in this presentation, and the first one we're going to look at is economic growth. Now, in terms of what you need to know the key drivers of economic growth, not the consequences, just the key drivers. So to actually illustrate what the key drivers are, we're going to use a simple production function, and I've drawn two production functions there. One, China is on the lower one and Australia is on the upper one. Now, in terms of this production function analysis, I've got 5 key drivers of economic growth. Now, certainly these are not the only drivers, but they are 5 of the main ones. So, in terms of the first one, returns to capital is all about the slope of the production function. And what you can actually see with these production functions, you've got capital per worker on the horizontal and output per worker on the vertical axis. What you can see with the slope of these production functions is that when a country is at a low level of capital per worker, it must therefore be at a low level of output per worker, but it will be on the steep portion of this production function. So China is a classic example here. And so in China, for example, compared to Australia, in China, if they accumulate capital and increase capital per worker, then the returns to that capital, or that growth in capital per worker, is quite high because they'll be moving up the very steep portion of the production function. So any movement, any increase in capital per worker horizontally means a very large upward shift in real GDP or output per worker. Now, compare that with Australia. If we accumulate the same level of additional capital per worker in Australia, we will earn smaller returns in terms of output per worker because we're on the flatter portion of the production function. Now, intuitively, this should make perfect sense. The way I like to think about it is, if you gave a typical worker in Australia $100,000 to spend on capital, what would that person typically do with that $100,000? Compare that to a worker in China. What would a worker in China do with the same $100,000? Well, in Australia, a lot of people already have as much capital as they need. So it would be simply a matter of perhaps purchasing a new computer, a new phone, whatever other technology that you actually use to do your job, purchasing perhaps new versions of that. Whereas the typical worker in China, you can imagine what they would do if you gave them $100,000 of cash and told them to invest that money in capital. So just through that very simple example, you should begin to appreciate why, if a worker has a low level of capital, the return, such as China, that worker will really benefit from accumulation of more capital. And so that's really point number 1, returns to capital. So that does partly explain why China has a natural growth advantage over Australia. By simply saving and investing money, accumulating capital, the typical Chinese worker will enjoy a much larger increase in productivity than the typical Australian worker. It's simply a matter of China having a greater potential for positive returns from capital accumulation. So China has a greater potential to grow in that respect. The second is savings and investment rates. Obviously, the more a country saves, the more it can invest, and the more it can invest, the faster it can actually move horizontally in this diagram and accumulate more capital. Now, you might be looking at that thinking, well, savings doesn't have to equal investment in an open economy, and that's true. However, if a country is a low savings country but a high investment country, then the difference between savings and investment in that country will need to be brought in from overseas. And if that's the case, then as those foreign savings coming into this country that we're talking about to supplement the low level of domestic savings, it will place upward pressure on that country's exchange rate, and reduce that country's ability to export. So having low savings but high investment does place a little bit of a constraint on the economy in terms of that country must therefore have a higher exchange rate, which will then lead to a weaker ability, I guess, to export. So number 2 is all about how quickly you move horizontally across the horizontal axis. And then 3, technology, human capital and efficiency, quite self-explanatory as drivers of growth. You want to accumulate more of each of those, and that will actually, in the diagram, shift the production function upwards. Okay, so in terms of this course, economic growth is only one slide. It's not a hugely important part of this course. I think for people studying this unit, there are more important things to learn than economic growth. If you want to read more about economic growth, there's plenty out there, but we're going to be spending more of our time on things such as business cycle fluctuations, government policy, exchange rates, interest rates, money moving around the world, all of that type of thing. So economic growth, while important, is not a large part of this course, but what you really need to take away from this topic are the key drivers of economic growth. If you are interested in doing more reading in terms of economic growth, one thing that I'll point you towards is the importance of good institutions for economic growth. Good institutions, examples are a stable government, a sound financial system, relevant laws, property rights. They are all called institutional factors. So those institutions are very important for economic growth. So perhaps you'd like to do a little bit more reading outside of this course in terms of the relationship between institutions and economic growth. The next is short-term fluctuations. Now this is important because we will be dealing later on with monetary policy and fiscal policy, and the whole aim of those policies are to smooth out short-term fluctuations in GDP. So what I've got here is a stylized representation of a business cycle. They don't actually look like this. This suggests that recessions and expansions occur with quite a degree of regularity. That's not the case. In Australia, for example, the last recession we had was in 1990-91, and that's going back quite a few years, a couple of decades in fact. So recessions and expansions are not regular as suggested by this diagram. They're quite irregular. Now, the thing to take away from short-term fluctuations in this particular topic is that there are peaks and there are troughs in the business cycle, however irregular they are. Now with these peaks, they do potentially cause problems in terms of high inflation. But as I've got and because of the high inflation, those peaks are really unsustainable. The problem with inflation that we'll see is that once inflation occurs, it can actually lock itself into the system. So if we allow the economy to go to a peak like this and inflation to increase from the Reserve Bank's target level of 2 to 3% up to say 6 or 7%, then that 6 to 7% inflation can lock itself in because it will actually push inflationary expectations up. And as soon as inflationary expectations rise, then that can actually lead to ongoing 6 to 7% inflation. Simply because we expect the higher inflation, we will get it because we'll act in ways that actually deliver that higher inflation through things like wage demands, and if you're running a business, for example, and inflation has been 6 to 7% in recent years, you'll automatically put your prices up every January by 6 to 7% based upon that expectation. So allowing inflation to increase is dangerous because it can actually lock in that higher inflation rate. Certainly inflation of 6 to 7% for say 1 year is not going to be too much of a problem if it does come back down to 2 to 3% the year later. But the problem is if it gets to 6 to 7% and then locks itself in to the system through higher inflationary expectations, that's when it can cause damage over the longer term. So with peaks, high inflation, we don't want that high inflation to be locked in. However, in the 1990s, early 2000s in Australia, we did go through a period of very strong productivity growth. There was a lot of investment in IT equipment, very strong productivity growth. There were import prices were actually falling in Australia, mainly coming from China. The prices were falling, and mainly because of the strong productivity growth, we had a boom in economic activity, real GDP, but also low inflation. So I don't want you to think that a peak always means high inflation. It usually means high inflation, but not always. If that peak is actually being driven by strong productivity growth, you can have a bit of a boom in economic activity up to a peak, and simultaneously low or lower than normal inflation. But as I said, normally when we hit a peak, inflation is quite high because we don't always have that strong productivity growth accompanying it. With a trough, obviously the problem there is a high level of unemployment. So in terms of this, we've got a trend, a growth trend line, which really is going to, the upward nature of that growth trend line is going to be determined by the rate of economic growth, but then in the short term we've got these cyclical fluctuations around the long-term trend line. The aim of fiscal and monetary policy is to try to smooth out this cycle. Okay, so for example, at a peak there's numerous things we can do. We can raise taxes, lower government spending, we can raise interest rates. So there's numerous things that the government can do, and we'll be learning about those and reading about those later on in the course, but there's numerous things the government can actually do to rein in spending during a peak. If we are at a peak in the business cycle, actually moving back to the growth trend line is quite simple. These days, monetary policy does most of the lifting, and it's a matter of simply raising interest rates until the level of economic activity, in particular the level of total spending, falls enough to bring the actual real GDP line back to the growth trend line. So what I'm getting at there is, if the economy is allowed to reach a peak, it's very easy to actually bring economic activity back down, because you simply keep raising interest rates until economic activity falls back down. However, getting out of a trough is very often not so simple. With monetary policy, in a trough, the central bank will lower interest rates. The problem with that is, first of all, interest rates can only go to zero, apart from the negative interest rate policies that we've been seeing in 2016. That is an exception, but in normal economic conditions we do have a zero lower bound on interest rates, so they can only go so low, and even when they go so low, the question then becomes, are these lower interest rates going to be effective? If the trough and the associated recession is severe enough, then even at low interest rates or zero interest rates, it still may not encourage the type of consumption and investment spending, which are both sensitive to interest rates, that we require to actually bring the economy out of the trough and back to the growth trend line. So interest rates, there's nothing magical about them. When they are lowered, sometimes, as we've seen after the global financial crisis, in those years after the GFC, those interest rates can be lowered, and still there won't be enough consumption and investment spending to boost the economy. In that case, these troughs can last for considerable amounts of time. So that's short-term fluctuations. In terms of business cycle fluctuations, you do need to understand what causes them, and I've put a reading up on LMS to help you understand what causes business cycle fluctuations, and I've got a simple representation of a supply curve, two demand curves, and a long run supply curve for a representative firm. So this might be your company, for example. What I'm assuming here is that this company can produce 50 units of output under normal operating conditions. So that is what we call their potential output. Now this company, however, can produce beyond 50, but only temporarily, because going beyond 50 units of output, by assumption, this company would have to run its capital very, very hard, reduce the maintenance, the regularity of maintenance on its capital, ask workers to work overtime in the evenings, weekends. Pushing capital and labour that hard to produce 70 units is not sustainable long term. 50 is the sustainable level. At 50, capital is being maintained regularly, and the workers are getting evenings and weekends to live the rest of their lives and enjoy themselves. However, in the short term, let's assume that there is an increase in demand from D1 to D2. Now, in the short run, if you are running a business, you have two options. The first is to keep the price of your product at $20 and increase output to 70. In the short term. So we're talking about a response of maybe just a couple of months. How would you respond to this increase in demand over a period of a couple of months? Your response after a year could be completely different. I'm just asking you to think short term, say 2 months. Now, if it was me, I would respond by increasing output. I certainly wouldn't increase price up to, say, $25, even though an increase in price up to $25 would mean that demand stays at 50, I wouldn't do that. What I would do is increase output. The reason being is that I would need to be convinced that this increase in demand from D1 to D2 was permanent before I started tampering with prices. So in the short term, I would move from A to B, 50 to 70 units. I would push capital and workers a little bit harder, incur the higher costs, and keep my price fixed at $20. The risk in raising prices to $25 too soon is that if this increase in demand is temporary and demand after 2 or 3 months moves back to D1, then I'm going to be in a situation where I raise prices for 2 or 3 months and then have to cut them again back down to $20. Now for my regular customers, I'll probably lose them, because chances are my competitors won't be messing around with their prices like this over the short term, and I'll probably lose those regular customers who will be quite annoyed at me for raising prices temporarily only to have them be cut 2 or 3 months later. They won't understand. I could probably do all the explaining that I like, but they won't understand why I temporarily charge them more only to cut prices back, and I'd probably lose those customers. So running this business, I'm more likely to play a wait and see approach, keep prices at $20, and just satisfy the market by producing a little bit more. Certainly what I don't want to do is experience the increase in demand, not raise prices, and also not increase production. That's going to annoy my customers as well. I've got to satisfy that extra demand at $20. I've got to produce 70. Now, over the longer term, however, if that increase in demand to D2 was permanent, then I'm more likely to raise my price to $25, because producing at 70 for too long is simply going to raise my costs beyond an acceptable level, because I'll be pushing capital and labour too hard. So as my costs rise, I'd almost be forced to raise price to 25 to try to get back to my nice comfortable output level of 50. So this really is, I hope you can appreciate how a lot of businesses operate. In the short term, they don't want to mess with prices, and they simply change their production to match demand. However, over the longer term, then they start thinking about changing prices. Now, in the short term, because I am very reluctant to change my price from $20, any change in demand is met by a change in production. And this is exactly why we get business cycle fluctuations. From month to month, quarter to quarter, demand, total demand in the economy changes. And if there are enough companies operating this way, when demand changes for Australian goods and services, it is output that changes, not prices over the short term. So initially we were talking about 2 to 3 months, but this could last for 6 to 8 to 12 months. This unwillingness to change price and responses in terms of output changes to changes in demand, not price changes. So over the course of a year, when demand changes, chances are output is going to change, employment will change, and bingo, we have a business cycle fluctuation. Of course, if we allowed price changes to do all of the heavy lifting, we wouldn't have business cycle fluctuations at all. Every time we had an increase in the demand for a product, the price would go up, and output would stay the same. Every time we had a fall in the demand for the product, the price would drop, and output would stay the same. We would have no business cycle fluctuations. But over the short term, prices are simply not that flexible for the reason I gave. The other reason, popular reason in economics that prices aren't flexible enough over the short term to absorb these sorts of changes in demand are menu costs. Every time you change your prices, you have to go into your computer system and change the prices there. You also have to let your customers know that your prices have changed. And certainly a business that changes its prices every 1 or 2 months up and down is not going to last too long. So even though in terms of removing business cycle fluctuations, if all businesses had flexible prices, we would really go a long way to counteracting business cycle fluctuations or actually eliminating them. But at an individual company level, that is just not optimal behaviour. So individually, companies act in their own self-interest by keeping prices constant in the short run and responding to changes in demand for their product by changing output, but when you aggregate that up economy-wide, it creates business cycle fluctuations. So the individual self-interest of firms behaving optimally for their circumstances for their customers in aggregate leads to sometimes quite severe business cycle fluctuations. And then finally, I've got a graph here from 1967 to 2011 of the Australian economy. Now, what we've got here is 2 periods of recession in Australia. We had a recession in 82-83, and you can see in 82-83 the solid red line, the unemployment rate, increased from around about just under 6% to 10%. Then we had another recession in 90-91 in Australia, and the unemployment rate went from around about 5.7% up to 11%. Now, the thing that I want you to focus on here is the fact that the unemployment rate during a recession increases quite quickly. But after the recession is over, which is typically 6-12 months later, the unemployment rate remains stubbornly high for quite some time. And we can see that in this graph that we've got in front of us. After the 82-83 recession was over, it took around about 9 years for the unemployment rate to fall back down to the level that it had been prior to the recession in 82-83. And in 1991, after that recession, it took the unemployment rate around about 9-10 years to fall back down to the level that it had been in 1989-90. So the unemployment rate can be stubbornly high, even after a recession is over. Now, the reason for this, after both of these recessions in Australia, 82-83 and 90-91, employers were very reluctant to rehire. So what companies were doing after the recession, after these recessions were over, they were so fearful that another recession was just around the corner that they, after firing workers, they simply asked existing workers to work harder, work longer hours. Companies in Australia also, to the extent that they could, became more capital intensive to reduce their reliance on labour. And that is two of the main reasons why the unemployment rate remains stubbornly high even after these recessions had passed. So that's quite an important point. I don't want people thinking that a recession or economic downturn increases the unemployment rate, but then the unemployment rate comes right back down as soon as the recession's over. That's not the case in Australia. Another major reason why the unemployment rate remains stubbornly high was that labour laws in this country mean that it is very costly to fire workers. There's redundancy payments and all sorts of other costs associated with firing a worker. So after these recessions, firms were, because of the cost of firing workers, they were very reluctant to rehire. They thought, if we rehire and another recession hits, we'll have to incur all of those firing costs again. So what we're looking at here is a higher degree of inflexibility in the labour market. The labour market was not able in Australia to respond very well after these recessions, and that's very often typical in OECD countries, and it's just a product of the way the labour markets operate in Australia and a lot of other OECD countries.